What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films and sci-fi films of the 1950s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host Josh Spiegel and this is the 50s Project. Welcome back to the 50s Project, where we're just plowing through this decade that was really formative and like horror and sci-fi were virtually indistinguishable. And we're going to go ahead and cover the entire year of 1952 in this episode because things were, still starting to get the ball rolling and not quite as many things had been released. So let's get right down to it and see what this year has to offer. 52 kicks off a little later than others since it's going to May 15th, and we're looking at the release of Red Planet Mars. It begins at a big telescope and some astronomers are on hand that include Captain Over, and when they get some images of Mars, but when they look at them they see evidence that there may be intelligent life up there. Plus, it seems as if they developed more advanced tech than on Earth, and they're curious if they can learn from them, although Linda is fearful. They have kids, and she's concerned that there'll be another war, and he'll have to be sent off to fight. There's also a scientist named Calder, and he's a former Nazi, and is being pressured by the Russians to find a way to contact Mars. But they realize the way to communicate is by transmitting the opening sequence of Pi. And soon enough, Mars is answering back. Soon they're able to have whole conversations, learning that Martians live to around 300 Earth years old, and the first thing they show is insurance companies canceling premiums and people wondering who's going to pay pensions. So even in the 50s, big business sucked, as there's then a total economic upheaval over the idea that Mars is a utopia in which everyone's needs are taken care of and there's no fear of war. The Russians are still working with Calder to try to get the messages first, especially after the US tries to keep them secret and away from the public in order to hold off additional chaos. And here's where it gets bizarre, because a new message from Mars claims that they denounce the Earth for not following the lessons given to them ages ago in the Bible, and that our problems are all based on our own sins. This somehow causes the downfall of the Soviet Union and causes revolution all over the world. But are these messages what they seem? Are they even from Mars at all? And this odd little number is from Harry Horner, and it was his first film. Although he'd never really kick into a bigger career and just did a handful of smaller films and TV shows afterwards. But he did also do a ton of work in the art direction side of things, and even won 2 Oscars for it. This was based on a play from 1932 called Red Planet, and it's strange because this was an era about the exploration of space. And here's a film about Mars, and yet every scene takes place here on Earth. And it's more about communication with an alien race than it is meeting one. It's a really clear indication of the tone in Hollywood at the time, with the Red Scare being in full effect and a strong fear of communism creeping throughout. The reviews at the time were decent, with most praising the performance more so than the overall story, and there's no information about its financial success, but it doesn't appear to have been a big hit. And this one's more interesting than good, so I'll give it a 2.5. It's doing some cool stuff, but it's so preachy and a bit pompous at times, and too much of it amounts to people just standing around in rooms talking. The cultural significance is just a 1.5, since this is one that never took off and didn't really stick in terms of public perception, but it had a young Graves involved and had a bit of notoriety. Should you watch it? From a historical aspect, I think you should. It's not all that good, but this is an interesting time capsule from a fear-filled time.
Dad, the Russians on the radio! Saffron cow!
Let's switch to horror, or at least a version of horror, with a film that came out in the UK sometime in July. but not in the US until sometime in '63. But it's Vampire Over London, which was also known as Mother Riley Meets the Vampire. It begins with a woman being pulled into a car and news reports about her being missing, and it seems to be the work of a scientist named von Hausen, who claims to be a vampire and descendant of Dracula. And when they look at a picture of him, well, he looks a hell of a lot like Dracula. There's then this little shop run by an old lady known as Old Mother Riley. And I'll discuss this a bit later, but she was an established character played by Arthur Lucan. Oh, yeah, there's a musical number.
Do I bang you like a drum? No, I lift up my finger and I say tweet, tweet.
And of course, Lugosi is indeed von Hausen, and he dresses like Dracula and sleeps in a coffin, and has some manservants, but merely believes himself to be a vampire as opposed to actually being one. His plan is to build 50,000 robots, but he needs uranium to do so, and his latest kidnapping victim had a map to a mine. Currently, though, he only has one robot, but whoops, it was accidentally shipped to Old Mother Riley's shop instead. She opens it up, and shenanigans ensue, with the B-Bot kidnapping the old lady and taking her to his hideout. But Mother Riley ends up being a little too clever, or maybe just lucky. Okay, so here's the deal with this one. It's a British film by John Gilling, and this was early in his career, and we'll see him again when we get to the 60s, since he directed Blood Beast from Outer Space and The Plague of the Zombies. And this was an entry of the Old Mother Riley series, because this is not a character just for this film, as this was the 18th entry of a series that featured the character. She first appeared in 1936 in a film called Stars on Parade, and did either 1 or 2 entries a year throughout a good portion of the 40s, always played by Lucan. None of the previous entries featured any horror or sci-fi elements, but since Lugosi was in the UK to play Dracula on stage, but that ended up going bankrupt unexpectedly and not happening, and the actor was stranded in London. So in order to help him pay for his way home, the producers of this film offered him $5,000 to appear, in an effort to appeal to American audiences. They tried to do a sequel to it in 1953, but Lugosi would have had to travel back overseas, and by that point, he was too ill. It would end up being the final entry of the series, although there was one planned called Old Mother Riley's Trip to Mars, but Lucan died in 1954 and the franchise went away. It was a box office disappointment in the UK, and attempts to release it in the US under the title Vampire Over London were unsuccessful. And I'm giving this a 2, since the humor just did not land with me at all. Like, this feels like a skit character, but dragged out to a full-length feature film. And it's not funny or interesting, so I lost interest right quick. The significance is only a 1.5, since it's not one that's known at all, but since it was the final entry of a popular UK series and had Lugosi in it, it gets an extra 0.5. Should you watch it? I'd say no, but if this type of humor is your cup of tea, then go for it.
Here, you can't work 24 hours a day if you belong to a union.
Yes, I can.
How?
Because I belong to 24 unions. And I work 1 hour a day for each union.
Let's go back to the US again and fast forward a bit to September 12th, and we're sort of in horror, but more fantasy world, I guess, with Untamed Women. We have a bomber pilot that goes through a surgery, and they're curious to hear his story, and they try a new serum that they developed. It works, and he's able to speak and tells of the story of his final mission. He was in a bomber, and they were flying over the ocean, and their engines died, so they crashed into the ocean. After drifting in a lifeboat, they come across a remote island and head ashore. They're not there for very long until they're trapped by a group of Amazons armed with spears who take them captive. I should point out that they're natives on a remote island, but I guess also have access to makeup and hair care products. They say that the hairy men killed the rest of their people, and then they say that the men resemble them, so their leader wants to kill them, but the tribe opposes. I guess I should also point out that Steve is played by Michael Conrad, who we just saw in The Flying Saucer, and I'm not really sure what's up with the beards here, but they're clearly just drawn on. I think it's because they were meant to have been there for some time, and the women compared them to the hairy men because of their facial hair, but none of the actors really had any, so they just, drew them on. But it turns out that those women aren't the only trouble, because there's what I suppose are meant to be giant-sized armadillos. They're the same size as the mammoths, so I guess they're either big ones or tiny mammoths. There's also big lizards and killer plants and eventually those hairy men. This one was an independent picture by W. Merle Connell, and he had only done a few things before this and would only do 2 films after this, but nothing else with either horror or sci-fi, so this is the final time that he'll be covered. It was done very quickly, shot in just 1 week, and a number of the special effects shot with the island creatures were just lifted from 1940's 1 million BC. Again, there's no details on how well it did, but it doesn't appear to have been a hit, and didn't have much play in the aftermarkets. And I'm just giving this a 2. It's tedious stuff, and only the final 10 minutes are any fun, really. I want to say that the monster stuff was fun, but it's all clips from other better movies, so even that was disappointing. The CS is just a 1 since it's not known at all and doesn't feature any genre names. Should you watch it, leave it untamed and unwatched. We're going back over the ocean, back to the UK, and now let's look at one that came out in October there, on an unspecified date, and arrived on American soil in the June of '53, and it's Ghost Ship. This has a married couple, Guy and Margaret, and they're looking to buy a yacht, and encounter a guy who tries to talk them out of the one that was advertised, but they insist on looking at it with the intentions of living on it. They check it out, and it's fairly run down, but they want to buy it anyway, and the shipyard manager tells them its story. Seems that after the war, a guy named Martineau fixed it up with fancy technology, and then set out with his wife and friend. However, later, some fishermen just found the boat out at sea, and when they go aboard, there's no one there. Later, a body washed ashore, and they check it out and confirm that it's not the professor, because it's missing a scar on his arm. Back in the present, the manager tells them that since then, there's been a bunch of people that have bought the boat, but they all sold quickly because they claim it's haunted. Guy doesn't believe him though when they purchase the yacht and start to fix it up, and when it's all ready, they have a maiden voyage with a bunch of friends. Weird stuff starts right away as there's a phantom cigar smell, and then has to hire a new chief since the old one quits after saying he saw a ghost in the engine room. But then the new guy quits as well, and that smoke smell continues. But since they spent all their money on it, the couple feel like they have no choice but to stay. But when Guy himself sees someone down there smoking it up, they call in a paranormal investigator. But what's really going on? Is the boat haunted? And this one was by Vernon Sewell, and he was a low-budget guy that did a number of genres, but never really had that one big hit that he was known for. It was based on a stage show called L'Angoisse, and was really funny is that this isn't the first time that Sewell would adapt that show. This was actually the 3rd of 4 different adaptations. The first was a short called The Medium in 1934, and he followed that up with Frenzy in 1945, and this was attempt number 3. The 4th wouldn't happen until 1961 with House of Mystery. The ship used in the film was Sewell's own, which helped keep the film's already meager budget down, and the lead couple, played by Dermot Walsh and Hazel Court, were a real-life couple. It didn't connect with audiences though, since the reviews were weak, and it didn't make a dent at the box office. One thing to note is that the 2002 flick is not related in any way and is not a remake. It's simply a different film with the same title. And this is okay. It's a 2.5. It starts off really strong, and the reveal at the ending is fun, but it sure does beat around the bush in order to get there. The significance is just a 1 though, since it's not known at all and doesn't have any known entities involved and just never made any waves. Get it? Waves. Should you watch it? Maybe. It's not a bad voyage, but don't blame me if you get seasick. This one is probably my favorite title for the year because on October 8th we had the release of Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla. Not just any gorilla, specifically a Brooklyn one. So this starts off in the jungle and a tribe finds these two dudes out cold in the middle of it. The chief's daughter, who again has perfect makeup and hair and fashionable jewelry, goes through their clothes and finds their IDs just as they wake up. And oh boy, it's Duke and Sammy, and this is the way that Sammy acts.
Well, gee, you sure look super, Chief. Super, Chief, Dad.
So yeah, you may notice a similarity here to another famous duo, and I'll get back to that in a bit. Seems Duke and Sammy were on the way to Guam, but fell out of the plane and parachuted in, and are now stranded. And oh my god, if you can get through like 10 minutes of Sammy doing his thing, then you are stronger than me, because this is just unbearable.
Hi! Well, I knew you'd get one of them eventually. Oh, I have a million of them. Well, listen to this one, listen to this one. Did you take a bath this morning?
Why, is there one missing?
There's then a song, and Duke looks pretty good in his shirt tied in the front. And I've tried, but I cannot pull this off in the same way. But that's likely because I have a food baby that sticks out of that little knot. They're told that they can get off the island with the help of Dr. Zabor, a scientist on the other side of the island, but most of the villagers are afraid of him. The doc is Lugosi for his second appearance of this year, and they comment that he looks familiar.
Ain't this the fellow that goes around with the hands in the faces, biting people on the neck and wearing capes?
You're crazy.
Watch out for bats!
He's doing experiments with monkeys, trying to ramp up evolution, and there's a love triangle as both Zabor and Duke have the hots for Nona. So the doc takes matters into his own hands and transforms Duke into a gorilla. But not just any gorilla. That's right, a Brooklyn gorilla. And this is a bit of a reunion since it's directed by William Bodine, and he had previously worked with Lugosi on The Ape Man, Ghosts on the Loose, and Voodoo Man. And we've covered so many Bodine films already. So, the thing with this one is that Sammy Petrillo, who is playing himself here, as is Duke Mitchell, was a comedian, and his whole gig was imitating Jerry Lewis. He even worked with Lewis for a time, and eventually he teamed up with Mitchell and emulated their live shows of Lewis and Martin. After a bit, they were seen in a performance, and it was decided to do a series of films with them, as a knockoff of the more famous comic pair, something that Jerry was furious about, and there were a number of legal challenges involved with the release of this film. The budget seems disputed because one source only says 12 grand, but another says 50, but either way, it was a very low budget. The reviews weren't all that bad, with several remarking that it was a decent approximation of a Martin and Lewis film, but just with no money. Although when Martin Landau was researching Lugosi to make Ed Wood, he watched it and called it one of the worst films he had ever seen. And it's not the worst I've ever seen, but it's pretty terrible. So it's a 2. It has some good stuff happening here and there, but it's ruined every single time that Petrillo opens up his mouth. I'm not really a fan of Jerry Lewis's comedy, so a worse impression of it just sinks the film. The significance is also a 2 because it was not a hit at all, but because of Lugosi, it got some notoriety and earned a bit of a name for itself. Should you watch it? Likely not, although or maybe just to see the scene where Sammy gets shot. Just 2 days later, also in the United States, we're back in the land of sci-fi as we check out October 10th's Captive Women. This one begins with talking about the bombing of Hiroshima, and the narrator tells us that we're looking at an alternate future world, 3000 AD, and a nuclear war has wiped out civilization. There's groups of people that remain, and one is a tribe of mutates, altered by the radiation. Another is the Norms, who escaped the mutations and live underground. They're about to have a wedding of their leader's son, but there's another group, the Upriver Men, and their leader is a dude named Gordon, who has a reputation for being a bandit. Young Robert is played by Robert Clark, who we just saw in The Man from Planet X, and the woman he's meant to marry has a thing with Gordon, but she's more interested in the power of marrying the chief's son. But then, the upriver folk raid the underground and steal a number of women in an effort to further populate their tribe. So, the Norms and Mutates have to team up to try to get them back. However, tensions among the two groups cause their own issues, so they may never get around to it. This was another low-budget picture, and it was from RKO. The director was Stuart Gilmore, and where he had directed a few films, he was mostly known as an editor. This would end up being the final film that he was the director for, although he'd handle a few TV show episodes, and would continue with editing on into the 70s. It was said to be a troubled shoot, though, as Clark claimed that Gilmore didn't know how to handle a production with that number of actors and special effects, and claims that it was his experience on this picture that led to him only directing TV afterwards. The budget was $85,000, which was on the higher end of the low-budget world at that point, but was still considered a B picture. And it did run on a double bill with another movie that we'll talk about at the ending of this year. And this is also a 2. It also sets things up pretty interestingly and seems like it's going to be a cool flick, and then just stops in its tracks and gets really dull. The significance is a 2 though, and even though it's not known at all and no one talks about it, it is considered to likely be one of the first films to deal with a post-nuclear apocalypse. Should you watch it? I'd say no. It's pretty skippable. We're headed back across the pond for this next one, and checking out a film that we've already seen a version of, because on October 23rd, in West Germany, Al Ran was released. It begins with a young woman escaping from a nunnery, although the nun in charge is happy about it because the woman exerted strange influence over the others there. Her escape is witnessed by young Frank, and he becomes smitten with her, even though he only saw her for around 30 seconds and from a distance. But hey, he's in love! He goes to find her, and luckily for him, he does so really easily, and it turns out that she's also interested in him. Her name is Alran, which is the German word for mandrake, like in the root, and Frank goes to her father, a professor of the university, to express his love for her. He doesn't approve, though, so the pair plan to run off together. So the professor reveals the truth. Alran isn't actually his daughter, and is the result of his attempts to develop a new method of artificial insemination. She's actually the child of a prostitute and an executed murderer. And because of this, Jacob believes that she has genetically inherited their sexual and murderous traits. When he takes off, Alran is very upset, but she also seems to have some sort of supernatural abilities, possibly thanks to an interest in the root that she's named after. But then it seems like bad things tend to happen to people around her, and her nature becomes darker and darker. I guess I should mention the professor is played by Eric von Stroheim, who we haven't seen on the project since 1944's The Lady and the Monster, and he was very renowned in both his home country and here in the US. And this is another version of a story from 1911 called Alran, And I covered another take on it back in the 20s project, which was also from Germany. And this is the 5th interpretation of it, although others are either shorts or lost. This particular version was by Arthur Maria Rabinault, a director that mainly just worked in his home country. It was controversial for the time as it focused on artificial insemination and sexual subtext, and it was denounced by church leaders. It did get some strong reviews in his home country though, and landed a US release, but not until 1957, where it was chopped down and retitled Unnatural: The Fruit of Evil. And I thought this was pretty solid, so I'm giving it a 3. It's a bit weird and that they're doing this sort of moral fable, but I'm never sure if they're saying that it's because of the murderer DNA or just the fact that it's artificial insemination. Either way, it feels a little overdone, but it is very pretty. The CS is just a 1 though, because it's not one that's well known and didn't really make any sort of dent in the industry, even with the inclusion of von Stroheim. Should you watch it? I'd say yeah, it's worth a look, even if for the performances and cinematography. Back in the US now, and here's one that had a debut in November 20th in Los Angeles and then moved to New York in December, and it's The Black Castle. The beginning has a man in a casket and they believe he's dead, but we hear his thoughts and he's very much alive, trying to implore them to realize it and stop them from being buried. We then flash back and that man is Ronald Burton, who's going undercover to try to figure out what happened to 2 friends of his that disappeared on the estate of a man named Count von Bruno. On the way, they stop over at a small tavern where the names of his missing friends freak out the barkeep. At the castle, we meet the Count, and he is an assistant, and it's none other than Boris Karloff in the only film that he did in '52, although he appeared in a number of TV programs during this time. Another person at his place is the brutish Gargon, and we have another Universal alum here with Lon Chaney Jr., and he was much busier in '52, but mostly in westerns. The Count and the crew are going on a hunt, and they plan to hunt down a leopard, although his wife approves. The Countess is Paula Corday, who hasn't shown up here since 1945's The Body Snatcher, which also had Karloff in it. But when they go out on a hunt, it's very likely that the Count has ulterior motives, and there's a reason why those friends went missing, and a very good reason why Ronald and the Countess are in those crates in the beginning. And this one was a return of sorts for Universal, dipping back into the horror game, although by this point all their spookier releases were more gothic horror than monster-based. The director was Nathan Juran, and this was his directorial debut, and he was previously an Oscar-winning art director. He'd later go on to direct some big stuff, a lot of which we'll cover here as the project goes on, with 20 Million Miles to Earth, The Deadly Mantis, and Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Juran wasn't the first choice to direct, as he was hired on to art direct here as well, but when Joseph Pevney, the original director, didn't like the script, he left. Since they were so close to the filming date, they opted to give Juran a shot at the job, and they liked what he did so much they signed him on for a contract. It would end up being the final horror-oriented picture that Chaney did with Universal, although he was far from done with the genre in general. It wasn't given as wide of a release as some others of the studio's pictures, and only ran in larger cities, but it was well reviewed, although it didn't become a big hit. And I'm giving this one a 3. It's pretty good, but feels a little bit directionless, and is perhaps too similar to last year's The Strange Door, which even had Karloff in a similar role. The significance is a 2, since it's a rare Universal horror in this period and had 2 of their biggest draws in it, and launched Juran, but it's not that well known and didn't change the industry much at all. Should you watch it? Yeah, I'd say this castle is worth a visit.
Again, I underestimated you. And I never dreamed you'd come of your own free will.
Earlier this year, we had Ghost Ship, which shared the title with a modern film, and that's happening again on December 10th with Invasion USA. There's this newsman that comes into a bar to get information about how people feel about rising tensions and taxes and such, and then there's this other guy sitting here, and you won't be used to seeing him so young, but horror fans, this is Connell Cochran. And if you're a sci-fi fan, this is the OCP's old man. Another guy strolls in, and he's a congressman, and they talk about political pressures going on. And I have to tell you, again, I know some people get all rankled up when I say this, but about 3/4 of the films I've talked about here have strong political and social messages in them, and not some subtle thing like you're always trying to defend. These films are upfront about their messages to the point that they may as well deliver their sermons straight to the camera. In fact, Omen basically does just that while looking in his snifter. But just then, there's a news report about enemy troops attacking US territories, starting in Alaska. They don't say who the attackers are, simply referring to them as the enemy, and they soon drop several A-bombs on US soil, and we retaliate by sending bombers to their homeland. The attacks continue, and I love that these people are still just at the bar, just chilling, not really seeming that stressed out, that they're saying thousands of people are dying. The stuff that they're talking about on the news seems to unfold over days, but they're just sitting there in the same spot, in the same outfits, with the same people around. They do keep showing the president, but he's never facing the camera, which I understand from a filmmaking aspect to keep it vague. But it's kind of funny because it seems like just no one told him which direction to look. And the attacks just keep on coming, and things start to look more and more dire, even if Vince and Carla just still keep it low-key and keep on going to that bar. And this was from a new company called American Pictures Corporation, and was only their second release, with the first being Captive Women. In fact, when I mentioned that one earlier and said it was the B picture, this is the film that it was attached to. The director was Alfred E. Green, and I'm super disappointed his last name isn't Newman, and he's old school and began directing back in 1916, and somehow never managed to land in horror or sci-fi until now. And about that, you might say that this is a war or action film and isn't part of sci-fi, but they talk about experimental nuclear weaponry, and it has an ending that dips into non-reality that qualifies it. The budget was $127K, but they managed to save a lot of money by simply taking stock footage of actual combat from World War II. The reviews were pretty good, and it did quite well with audiences and earned a profit of around $1 million, but it didn't really land when it came to the aftermarket. In 1985, there was a film called Invasion USA featuring Chuck Norris and a similar premise, although it's not really a remake. It's not really known if it was intended to be one, like a loose one, or if it just shared a concept and title. It did get more of a highlight when it was featured on MST3K and became one of their more notable episodes. And I'm just giving this one a 2, not because it's mainly just silly propaganda, but because it's more like half newsreel footage. It's more like a compilation of stock footage than a film, and without robot shadows cracking jokes, it's just not that appealing. The significance is a 2 as well, since it did become more known, but not to any great degree, and was more the Rift version that garnered its cult following. Should you watch it? I definitely recommend the Mystery Science version, not so much the regular one. So there you have it, all of the horror and sci-fi releases of 1952, and it was a pretty weak year. Not really that much that was outstanding. So I think my favorite of this block is, I guess it's The Black Castle. I mean, I didn't think it was that great, but it was enjoyable, the most enjoyable of this run. So yeah, not the best 1952. But let me know which of these was your favorite down below in the comments. Which of these have you seen? Which of these would you now like to see? which of these have you just never heard of? Tell me that down below in the comments. If you like the video, hit the like button. If you enjoy the channel, subscribe to it. And go check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can help support this channel and keep it going. I appreciate that. And yeah, we're going to keep on going because I think after this is when it's going to really start to kick in as we move on to the following years of this decade, the 1950s, right here on the 50s Project.